Hi, welcome to Tinfoil Handkerchief Alignment, and today I wanted to do my first Bible reinterpretation, and I thought the best place to start with that would be what I consider to be the guidelines of God, the Ten Commandments. I've always felt that no matter what we debate about when it comes to religion, the Ten Commandments are essentially a playbook of how to live in God's image. However, I do also think that Jesus was a little more concise about how it ultimately comes down to treat everyone the way you want to be treated. Further to that, I would add, despite how they treat you. It's easy to implement it into daily life, and it costs nothing to be a good person to another person. As I've mentioned before, I believe that everyone's spirituality and their connection to God is personal. It doesn't mean don't share your experience. It means not judging others because of how they nurture that connection within themselves if it differs from your interpretations of God's teachings. There are people who consider themselves more Christian than me who are likely not going to agree with my interpretation of the Ten Commandments, and that's fine. I just wanted to look at the commandments through a modern lens and discuss how I often see them interpreted versus how I interpret them myself. Just to be clear, I'm not trying to rewrite the Bible, but I see so many people accuse each other of not following God or being a sinner or not being a good Christian. We're all sinners, but I believe God is about forgiveness and allowing for forgiveness and opportunities to grow and do better. God usually leaves repentance up to choice, emphasizing the free will of the individual. So I personally feel that someone judging another's spiritual journey and how they connect to God is almost like trying to take or block their path to personal repentance. I say it like that because I think a lot of people feel like they are too big of sinners and farther from God when that happens. I don't actually think that's true in a lot of instances, but I think many would be more likely to choose a path towards God and repent for how they feel like they've sinned if their path to redemption isn't full of other people's judgments. Some people take the commandments really literally, but I think there are actually a lot of nuances within each. I just wanted to give considerations to some aspects of the Ten Commandments that I often don't think a lot of people consider. And again, this is my personal interpretation. You don't have to agree, but we can agree to disagree. Also, I won't be using the actual Bible terms for the commandments because there are variations, and I don't want that to become the focus of the episode if it's different than the Bible that you read. And I think it's important to look at them from a fresh, modern perspective, and I think modern language may help with that a little bit. So, let's revisit the Ten Commandments. Don't murder. This one should be pretty self-explanatory and easy to understand, but I do personally think that this one can get misinterpreted as well, particularly when it comes to whether or not abortions are considered murder. I will say I think it's important to note that not all kills are murders, and I think that's an important distinction to make. I'm not condoning taking a life. I'm just saying that even in the justice system, there are different degrees and different categorizations as such based on intent. For example, hunters generally aren't considered murderers if they hunt for sport, even though the world is advanced enough that most people don't need to hunt for food because they can just go to the store. But when hunting was more primitive, it was for food and fur and that sort of thing out of necessity, whereas now it's not. Now the intent is more for them to just go and enjoy hunting. That's not considered murder, and most people don't think much of it. Others are super radical against it, but again, to me, this is something that's more nuanced. I'm not into hunting myself, but I don't judge people who hunt for doing that, even if I don't really like that there's a sporting component of it, because I do know that there are people who do enjoy it. But even when my dad and I would go fishing, we would never really keep them. And you could throw them back into the water and everybody has a good day. We still got to enjoy the sport of it, but the fish also still got to enjoy being fish. I think the topic around abortion is nuanced as well, and I personally think it depends on the situation. But overall, I believe it's up to the individual to determine what they're able to reckon with within their own conscience. There's a difference between an oops and an extenuating circumstance. But I do think it should be a choice within a couple, but it depends on the situation, and it is ultimately the woman's body, though the man should be consulted, in my opinion. I also think the topic of abortion also kind of distracts from what this particular commandment is really about, though. I personally think this commandment ties into multiple other commandments in the sense that it could be looked at like putting yourself before God, which is the way I've always looked at this one, in the sense that taking a life is like making a judgment that's not yours to make. make. So while you may not understand or agree with my stance on abortion as it relates to this commandment, and could argue that abortion is making a judgment in itself, I think it's more a matter of judging quality of life in that situation. And there's also a fairness that needs to be applied within dual aspects as well. So I believe that abortion is the opposite of the concept of IVF. Both are individual decisions about making or taking life. So essentially, I believe that if you're supportive of IVF, then you shouldn't judge someone if they feel like abortion is their best option, especially since IVF usually implants multiples, most of which don't take. And many women go through multiple rounds of implantation before finding success within someone who may not have been able to conceive naturally or struggle to do so. But realistically, in an IVF situation, there is usually just as much potential for life lost as is created. So that's what I mean by consideration for the dual aspects, because I see abortion as the dual aspect of something like IVF. And when it comes to abortion, it's also really easy for people to judge from the outside what someone should do, but you also don't see people giving the same judgments to those who are receiving IVF treatments, usually because it's just seen as creating life. The reality is most women don't choose adoption because of the emotional load of carrying to term a baby that they're going to give away. Again, I personally believe it should be an individual's choice about what the weight of their conscience can carry, but I also think it's about intention. And also, to be clear, intention and justification aren't the same thing. I think it's important to consider here that when it comes to abortions and IVF, it's an individual choice. I'm not saying either is good or bad. There are pros and cons to both sides, but that's why I think they should be looked at as two opposite sides of the same argument so that there is a better overall perception of what it means for both of them, if that makes sense. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Also another one that should be pretty self-explanatory. There are other things that could be considered cheating beyond what it means in a relationship. It's also cheating when you're taking a shortcut to achieve something not earned on merit or to take it from someone else. I think the online world has made this a little more complicated, but I also think where this gets confused is the unhealed aspects within self and an emotional disconnection with a partner. I personally don't think it's just all about sex. And it's not just online per se, but I think online has more to do with more ways people can have emotional affairs, even if they're not necessarily physical ones. I believe emotional affairs happen because of the lack of emotional intimacy and more about not being able to be honest with your partner. So it's like you're seeking out what you feel like you're missing somewhere else. Just as if there's a mismatched sexual connection or a lack of desire that's uneven between partners, someone is likely to go outside of that relationship to find it. And I'm not here to judge those who step outside of their relationships. Their reason for it are their own, and again, something that they have to decide whether or not the weight of their conscience is worth it. And please know that I say that as a former other woman. I'm not proud of it, but that was an unhealthier time in my life and a pattern that I saw develop, which ended up being an emotional wound within myself that I had to heal, particularly where it came to my own self-worth. For a long time, I really didn't actually believe that I deserved to be more than a side piece. But once I corrected that within myself, I saw how I was letting myself be devalued even more than I had already felt internally. So that is not something that I choose to participate in anymore. And I'm not trying to condone my own sinning kind of actions in the past, but that was a time in my life that happened, and it is something that I do still acknowledge. But again, it was a part within myself that I needed to heal. And I can also say that most of my justification was in that I was never actually in a relationship at that time. So I myself wasn't stepping out on anyone. And within those situations, I was also not the original pursuer. Though I can admit I could have had a little more self-worth to set some boundaries and not get involved with guys who were already in relationships. Like I said, these are aspects that I realized I needed to heal within self and have since worked really hard to actually heal those aspects within self. So for me, again, I can't reiterate enough that it was more of a self-worth issue on my part. And I'm sure there are a lot of nuances within a lot of individual situations within relationships. I've mostly been single my whole life, so I can't speak too much on that. But I do overall think that it comes down to low self-worth, lack of trust, and not knowing how to articulate emotional, physical, or otherwise wants and needs with a partner. And possibly being judged if you do have a want or need that maybe your current partner is not used to, sort of thing. I've also said in a previous episode that I also believe that what prevents many people from being able to truly love and trust others is not loving or trusting ourselves enough to believe that someone else will. Although many relationships do have a genuine love and a level of trust, it starts as the worry that a partner won't accept all of you if there are pieces of you that are broken and still need some extra healing. I think sex itself is a secondary issue, but I think it mostly comes down to men not feeling desired and women seeking an attentive partner and a more intimate connection. Sex and physical intimacy are also two separate things. So while it's not specific for men or women to cheat, I think the reasons why they do as it pertains to sex or intimacy are often different. An inattentive partner who, while you're doing it together, is doing it more for themselves is probably more accurate to why women seek other things. I also believe that most men believe or have been taught that intimacy and sex are the same thing. But I don't necessarily think that's true, and I don't think that a lot of women would agree with that. Further to that, I think there are a lot of men who think just the act of doing it is what women find enjoyable. And while that can be true, I don't think that's the reason if someone is stepping out on a long-term relationship. Because I think that many women are more attracted to an attentive partner and intimate experiences that feel mutual. I truly do think it comes down to trust and intimacy within a connection. If you want to hear me further elaborate on that, I would recommend checking out my episode about the sacral chakra. But I personally think it's the lack of emotional connection that leads to a disconnection in physical intimacy. I will also say that although I, as many others, often automatically associate this commandment to intimate relationships, I do think it applies to other interpersonal connections as well and some other situations. Again, I was making the reference to taking shortcuts to get ahead, right? That is considered cheating as well, even if it's not necessarily adultery in a relationship sense. Don't steal. Again, I thought this one was pretty self-explanatory, but it's not just about money and stuff. Unfortunately, I think the harder it gets for people to survive financially, the more people resort to stealing. Fraud has also become seemingly a pretty big thing, but I don't think it's just about that. It's basically taking something unearned from someone who's earned it. I think this commandment and the remaining two all kind of go together. I say that because in modern day, I see people who covet and bear false witness in order to steal from others. So that's why I say the last three commandments are kind of connected to each other. And it's more often than not, so they themselves can take a shortcut to achieve or attain what they're looking to achieve or attain, rather than making the effort to earn it themselves. They're trying to take it from someone else who's already attained that, or who has what they perceive as something more than what they have. And I also think that stealing can more often than not be perceived as coming down to jealousy and or impatience, which again are aspects within self that should be healed rather than trying to take something from someone else. Though thefts increase when people can't really afford to live, and I'm not condoning stealing, I'm just saying there's a difference between doing something out of survival and doing something out of impatience, greed, or laziness. Or in some cases, just because you can. As is what people tend to do to me. Don't bear false witness. I'm not sure if people get this one confused as much as they think of it from a more narrow perspective. What I mean by that is I think most people think of it more in terms of like a court situation rather than in day-to-day regular life. Though it does apply to court situations as well, it can also look like gossip or contriving false narratives. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that you can't ever talk about anyone or participate in gossip or anything like that. I'm just saying it's important to be mindful of the overall impacts. This is the digital age, and harmless gossip can spread quick, and false narratives can have severe impacts on people's lives and the public perception of them, especially in the age of cancel culture. Also, it's important to recognize that just because someone who did something doesn't want to take accountability for it, doesn't mean the person saying they did it is bearing false witness. In my opinion, it would actually be closer to the opposite, where the unwillingness to take accountability and knowingly allowing the consequences to be redirected, which in itself is bearing false witness, especially if it's against someone you know is innocent, but you're still allowing them to take the fall for it, just so you don't have to, kind of thing, even though they are the consequences of your own actions. I would also say that I don't think bearing false witness strictly applies to how we treat or talk about other people in this regard. I also think it pertains to how we represent ourselves. Now, I do want to be clear, because I think this seems to be where things get a little blurry. I think there's a difference between maintaining some separation between personal and professional lives, and I don't think a healthy boundary is misrepresenting yourself. I will say, though, that I don't necessarily think that, for example, with presenting a more aesthetic lifestyle on social media would be misrepresenting yourself, but it kind of depends on how different the presentation is from your real life. Good lighting and being bougie would be closer to something like vanity or pride, in my opinion. And I do think you should be able to present yourself as more polished or professional online than in real life, but that doesn't necessarily make it less authentic, because you should be allowed to relax and be a little bit sillier or less put together in your personal life. For me personally, I rarely even use filters on my pictures, though I have come to appreciate good lighting. I'm not polished, but I don't pretend to be. But I can pull myself together to be a bit more presentable when I need to be, such as when I'm making a presentation. I'm still intelligent, entrepreneurial, and well-spoken, even when I'm in track pants. Even though I'm not as presentable when I'm wearing track pants. And I'm still working on toning down my profanity. However, I always say that I use it as emphasis, though I know that's not an excuse. I just talk like that, and I have for a long time. But that is also one of those things that I do more in my personal life that I wouldn't necessarily do in my professional life. But again, that's not me not being true to myself. It's just me being more professional in a professional situation, whereas I would be less so at home. And it shouldn't minimize my good qualities or strengths just because I'm dressed down or because I throw in an F word. So to me, the difference between work and home, or using filters, or making things look a little more aesthetic or perfect than they aren't necessarily misrepresentations as it pertains to bearing false witness. Though they could be, like I said, I would consider those specific aspects closer to something like pride or vanity. I would say, though, that I think something like lying on your resume would be a little bit more representative of bearing false witness as it pertains to yourself. Maybe it's because I think a lot in terms of chakras and energy, and how most things are either the result of an overactivity or a blockage. I would also consider turning a blind eye in situations that could use the support, comparable to lying by omission, because you could speak up and you don't, kind of thing. Especially if there's a consequence to someone, especially if they're innocent, if you don't speak up, kind of thing. However, I should be clear that just because these are my interpretations of the commandments doesn't mean they have to be yours if you don't agree. I just personally think that we've gotten away from these because of how they were previously interpreted hasn't been modernized for present day, in the sense that things like dating apps, cyber scams, and IVF didn't exist when these were written. So we don't necessarily consider the commandments to apply to modernized things, or we're still looking at them from an older perspective. But again, this is just my personal opinion. But I don't think some lesser actions actually constitute as bearing false witness. But in modern day, in a lot of cases, I think the reason why people bear false witness actually leads me to the 10th commandment. Don't covet other people's stuff. When I was growing up, and even still to this day, this has been phrased as coveting your neighbor's wife. So this is another one where I think a lot of people in modern day look at it from a more narrow perspective than I personally think that it should be. The term neighbor, even in a Bible context, is more of a generalized term for people other than yourself and not necessarily an actual physical neighbor. Coveting in a general sense is longing for or obsessing about what someone else has. And like with bearing false witness, I think there's levels of severity, but I interpret it more as if you covet to the point that you'd break other commandments, or in other words, turn away from God in order to obtain what it is you're coveting. I also think that our perspective of what it means to be Christian has gotten a little more misrepresented in the last decade, and I find it to be a lot more deceptive and performative, which I say because I feel like we've also gotten farther away from more traditional Christian values while repackaging it as something like a trad wife. This kind of goes back to the previous commandment as well, but for example, a trad wife is a presentation. I'm saying that many are maintaining an image based more in superficiality than actually living in God's image. The reason why I say that as it pertains to trad wives is because they're a part of a pop culture community where there is intense pressure to fit in, live up to an image, or maintain a certain level of public presentability. The more you care about what other people think, the more strained your own relationship with God can become, because you're putting the opinions of others before the opinion of God, if that makes sense. And if or when that focus becomes more on what someone else is doing to the point it causes a feeling of disparity within yourself, you are coveting what someone else has and not showing enough gratitude for what you have. The way I look at coveting on an individual level comes from a lack of contentment and confidence within self. Now, I'm not saying that hoping or aspiring to more is coveting, but it's a matter of being grateful for what you have and also working towards your own goals in a healthy, positive way so that you're earning what you have and not trying to take it from someone else. It's similar to what I said in the Aries episode about having healthy boundaries within competition, and that it's okay to use something else as a benchmark or baseline, because you can still push yourself to do better, work on yourself in order to compete with your competition at a higher level, sort of thing is how I see it. I'd say you see a lot of something like that within businesses, but it's more prevalent now with lifestyles on social media as well. They're essentially aspects of the same thing. In my opinion, a lot of businesses these days try to one-up their competition in the same aspects, rather than focusing on their individual strengths in their own company in an effort to follow consumer trends. But if you're always following something, never the trendsetter. So you're always going to be coming from behind. If you're always competing in an aspect someone else does better, when you have something unique within yourself, in my opinion, you're selling yourself short a little bit. Sometimes it's a risk to set the trend, but then you're the first if it works, even when being compared to your competitors. I also think of it in terms of mom and pop shops or independent stores being bought up by conglomerates. Usually they get bullied until they're eventually absorbed by bigger, blander stores with more money. Somewhere within those mergers is usually something that the independent stores have that conglomerates want, though it's usually positioned as a financial decision because costs are higher for independents. So the conglomerates just kind of take it over, usually eliminating or dealing a significant blow to the competition. That's coveting. And to be clear, I'm not saying business is bad or conglomerates are bad. I'm just saying I think a lot of bigger businesses feel less confident about who the customers would choose if given more options. And again, this isn't specific to business. I'm just using business as an example for this. If you're confident in your product and your business, you don't have to covet. You're more in your own lane, even if you're in the same competition. So when the sales are made, you've actually earned those sales, and it would be a better, stronger, more loyal customer base. It means you don't always need to do the same thing as your competitor because everyone has different strengths and weaknesses. And again, this isn't just business. I'm just using this as an example because that's where you see it more openly and on a larger scale. On a smaller scale, I'd go back to the social media thing. Again, social media in itself isn't bad. Looking at the lives of other people and wanting to improve your own isn't bad. But as long as it stays a healthy competition and doesn't turn into how do I get what they have. Although most of us feel like we don't have enough, I think many just want to live comfortably, and it's important to be grateful for what you do have, especially because there are people who do have a lot less. Though living in comfort and luxury would be great and can be a reasonable, healthy goal, it's about how you go about attaining that makes the difference. So I hope you've enjoyed this overview of the 10 Commandments. Again, these are just my interpretation interpretations and you don't have to agree with them. I just wanted to provide a bit of an alternative perspective in a more modern way to some of these, because I just wanted to share some nuances in my perspective to help modernize these a little bit. Because again, treating others the way that you want to be treated and not how they treat you, and the 10 Commandments, I believe, are more like the guidelines of God, and how we can still live in and represent God's image in a physical sense. If you're interested in booking any energy healing services or card readings, check out my Etsy shop or become a member on Patreon with multiple membership tiers to choose from. Or check out my other YouTube channel, Tinfoil Handkerchief Tarot, for general collective readings. Until next time, keep the peace.